Indeed, to call Mrs. Douglas's patriotism into at least sort of a dubious, put it into a dubious light.
His campaign style was slashing, burning, looting, raping, pillaging his opponent's record, his opponent's character, his opponent's personality, his opponent in every way possible. And it worked.
Richard Nixon beat Helen Douglas by a wide margin, but she had her revenge. During the campaign, she characterized him with a nickname, and it was one that would stay with him forever: Tricky Dick. 1952, and the first TV spots ever made were for Ike Eisenhower.
For president, you like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike. For president,
I believe in the future of the United States of America.
General Dwight Eisenhower was the larger-than-life hero of World War II.
His next stop is Washington, D.C.
He and the 39-year-old Richard Nixon barely knew each other when the young senator was selected as his running mate.
Nixon was chosen not because Eisenhower thought he was the best man, but because he was the right balance for the ticket. And Eisenhower always had a certain lofty distaste for some of the tactics that Nixon used.
The first big test of their relationship came less than 2 months into the campaign, when a front-page story in the New York Post claimed Nixon had a secret $18,000 fund for personal expenses paid for by millionaire backers. There were calls for Ike to drop Nixon from the ticket. Pat Nixon urged her husband to fight.
She said that, no, Dick, we both know what you have to do. You have to fight it through to the end. And my father told me years later that those were the words he really needed to hear then.
You are about to hear a report from Senator Richard Nixon, nominee for the office of Vice President.
Though Ike did not rush to Nixon's support, he did arrange for an unprecedented half-hour of TV time in which Nixon could defend himself against the charges. Richard Nixon knew the speech could make or break him. He would have to sell the most valuable thing he owned, his reputation, to the American people.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency. And as a man
in the speech, Nixon laid bare his finances as he tried to show he had the same problems as every other American.
We lived rather modestly. For 4 years, we lived in an apartment in Park Fairfax in Alexandria, Virginia. The rent was $80 a month.
Throughout the speech, Pat sat by his side, and then he brought her into the drama.
I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything.
Towards the end of the speech was its most famous moment, reference to a gift to his daughter from a supporter.
You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep him.
And then, perhaps in anger at Ike's less than unqualified support, he showed how tough a political fighter he could be. He went over Ike's head to save his career by asking for direct support from viewers.
Wire and write the Republican National Committee whether you think I should stay on or whether I should get off.
He double-crossed Ike. He put the decision in the hands of the people rather than in the president's hands.
Telegrams of support poured in, but Pat Nixon never forgot the humiliation of the whole episode.
My father had to lay bare their whole financial picture. My mother's so private, and it was so painful to have everything that they owed listed, their life insurance, etc. It was a questioning of their integrity that she's never gotten over since.
The Checkers speech has remained central to the myth of Richard Nixon.
He could be corny. The moment that drove the elitists up the wall was the Checkers speech, which was an extraordinarily effective speech. They had this candidate for vice president pulling out all the emotional stops, right down to his dog. You know, it's okay if FDR uses fella, but for Nixon to use Checkers, they recognized it as all too effective and cornball and aimed at the lowest common denominator.
I think it was a masterpiece. It's laughable now. People laugh about it, oh, ho, ho, you know. But in fact, he saved himself in the ticket, and I think it is not beyond consideration he may have saved the Eisenhower ticket.
Eisenhower conducts a whirlwind speaking
With
tour
Nixon now firmly in place, the campaign continued on to November and an overwhelming victory over Adlai Stevenson.
Illinois falls to Ike, a sign of the end. It's Eisenhower by a landslide.
Richard Nixon's relationship with Ike was now set. He'd play the politician to Eisenhower's statesman.
And Eisenhower concerned himself, of course, with great matters of policy, and he left Nixon to these grubby little political things, and Nixon snapped that up. I think it was always in Eisenhower's power to cut Nixon off at the knees. Nixon knew that, and that's not the makings of a warm personal relationship when one guy's holding the hatchet and the other one knows it.
Still, Richard Nixon suffered from the usual curse of near anonymity bestowed on all vice presidents. That changed dramatically in 1955 when Ike had a heart attack.
A stunned nation hears that its president is stricken with a heart attack at the Denver home of his mother-in-law, Mrs. John Dowd. As an anxious nation awaits, newsmen converge on the press secretary for information.
Suddenly, Richard Nixon was in charge of the nation. With his growing wariness toward the press, he was careful to avoid doing anything that would bring charges he was too eager to take over.
In the meantime, the business of government will continue as usual.
I think Nixon's performance was exemplary. He avoided any appearance of usurping power, yet he did give the appearance of being there and being in charge.
The president's car arrives for the meeting, and the president himself steps briskly out, showing few signs of the heart attack that kept him hospitalized for 7 weeks.
By the 1956 election, Ike had recovered, but there were Republicans worried about his health who were unhappy to see Nixon poised to become president. Once again, Ike was excruciatingly slow before he finally gave his okay to keeping Nixon on the ticket. The team won a massive victory in November.
As returns rolled in on election night, the result was never in doubt. It was a landslide for the Eisenhower-Nixon ticket.
Richard Nixon was now entering his second 4 years as vice president, but he still had to prove that he could head a presidential slate himself. For many voters, that began to change with a visit to Latin America. In 1958, pro-communist demonstrators attacked Richard and Pat Nixon's cars in Peru and Venezuela.
Mr. and Mrs. Nixon are spat upon and reviled, while an inadequate police guard sits by, helplessly.
The electrifying pictures showed a remarkably cool Richard Nixon at the eye of the hurricane. He was hailed back home as a hero. Then, a year later, in another triumph, Nixon was in Moscow at a trade fair. As the two countries vaunted the superiority of their systems, Richard Nixon's performance in a dialogue with the fiercely uninhibited Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev grabbed the attention of the world.
Very early in the morning, went down to visit a market.
Nixon was a man who knew when he was in trouble. And at the U.S. exhibition in Moscow, he had a brief debate on television with Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev wiped up the floor with him. He was aggressive and pushy and belligerent almost. And Nixon was trying to be Mr. Nice Guy.
Says Mr. Key, the Soviet will overtake America and then wave bye-bye.
And Nixon came out of that first debate recognizing that he'd almost blown his career. And this was going to be the way his confrontation with the communist leader would be reported and seen.
William Safire was the press agent for a model American house at the exhibit. He guided Nixon and Khrushchev to its kitchen, where Nixon made a comeback in what's become known as the kitchen debate.
And luckily, I caught a picture of Nixon being assertive and Khrushchev sort of standing back like this. Well, I haven't taken a picture since. I mean, that one made every front page all over the world.
Richard Nixon had shown himself a formidable figure on the international stage. He would now try to show he was ready for the White House.